So one of the first things that I always think about in tech that I personally think was significant was providing real-time information to the public, not just to the agency internally. That was step number one, was okay, I now have this tech where I know where all my vehicles are as an operator of a service. But that shifted towards, well, why can't we give the public that same information?
Okay, well, I'm really excited about this episode. So, Carol, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast to talk with me.
Absolutely happy to do it.
I thought it would be good. I do it with everybody. I feel like you're very well known, but if you wanted to give an introduction to yourself, your name, your role, if you want, you can check your organization in there, and then something you're passionate about.
So, Carol Schweiger, president of Schweiger Consulting, been doing this for 10 years on my own. Just to give people a tiny bit of background, I've been working in the ITS sector in public transit mostly now for a very long time. I don't know that I'll disclose the number of years, but what I'm really passionate about, especially in the last 10 years or so, are finding the right solutions so that everyone who's traveling has options, no matter where they live, where they're going, what the demographics are. Everyone should have multiple choices. And it shouldn't just be, gee, I own a car. I'm just going to jump in my car and go somewhere. So I'm thrilled that in the last 10 years, we've moved the conversation to talking about moving people rather than moving cars. So that's my passion.
I think it's good. The equity piece, I think, is coming through a lot more, but there's a trend in that conversation as well, where because I think people had options before, but they weren't like legitimate options. They were kind of there to serve a purpose of you have this, but then if you were to ever try and use it, it either didn't line up properly or it wasn't really accessible. So it's kind of, I feel like that's starting to shift, which is nice.
It is starting to shift, and it's now the emphasis is more on the traveler rather than the organization providing the service, which is why I think those mismatches happened in the earlier days. You know, don't you know that you have all these different options, but if they don't work for you, then so I am glad to see that shift in that discussion as well.
Mm. I read there was an ITS international article. I think it was done by Adam Hill, correct?
Yes, correct.
So it was I really liked it because you talked about your early experiences and how you got into transport, which I always find really interesting because I don't think anyone wakes up one day and they're like, I'm really interested in transport. I'm going to go study pavements and buses. So you mentioned in that article your early experiences watching subway trains helped
Yes.
spark this interest in transportation. How did that interest in trains and subways then lead to a full-blown career in transport?
So that in my very early days, I would my family would go and visit my grandparents in Brooklyn, New York, right in the heart of the city. And I did spend a lot of time standing on a bridge over subway tracks that led into a station that was not very far from where they lived, and I could kind of watch things go in and out. And when I was a little girl, I'm sure my parents were horrified by this. But as a little girl, I wrote letters to what is now the New York City transit system, saying, asking questions like, why do you run some trains express and some trains local? And then I would stand on that bridge and just watch, wave to the conductors. And what it led me into is in college, I really kept that interest in transportation. And even though I grew up in the suburbs, that experience in New York City, which was year after year after year when my grandparents were living there, it stuck with me that here's this whole science, if you will, of moving great numbers of people without automobiles. And that really, it stuck with me. When I went to college, in my undergraduate program, there were no courses in transportation. And in fact, at that time, there were really not a lot of undergraduate programs where you could learn about how do you plan these systems, how do you operate them. This was pre technology discussions, just basically how do you put one of these systems together and operate it for the good of the public. So I did some research and decided, well, hey, if I'm a math major, if I graduate with a BS in math, it'll give me some foundation to go to graduate school and be in a transport program. And that was pre sort of discussing the customer side of it. It really was before we started to shift our focus to, well, actually, what do all of those travelers need? Sure, we're providing these services, but are we providing the right ones? So, from the earliest days of playing a game with my brother, where we memorized the New York City subway system and we memorized the stations and we would quiz each other on these long trips to New York City. It kind of stuck with me in a lot of different ways.
It's funny. I was talking to Chandra Bhatt from the University of Texas yesterday, and it's really funny because there were some parallels between what you've mentioned and what he mentioned insofar as there was the lines of there was no like official kind of transport sort of arm. It was all rolled into civil engineering or civil construction. And so
Exactly.
I did maths instead. You both kind of said that.
Yes, it just didn't exist back then. People used to say, "Oh, so you know how to build a road?" And I'd say, "No, not exactly. I know how to develop a transit system, but not how to build a road."
One thing you mentioned as well was the changes in technology and how obviously a lot of the stuff that we have now just didn't exist.
Exactly.
What are some of the significant changes in transport tech? And that doesn't necessarily have to be what we now consider technology in like that digital sense. It can be maybe some of the really cool, innovative stuff that happened earlier on, just to kind of widen that a little bit more.
There are a couple of things that come to my mind in the tech discussion. Again, like you said, years ago, we didn't have discussions about that because the tech wasn't really well developed. One thing that I've seen over my career is that shift from those services that are out there, but they're not really designed for the public. They were just developed with some smart transport planners. And They did the best job they could, but there was very little input from communities on what their needs were. And I'm starting with that, moving towards the technology, because as things have changed on the planning side, we've been able to provide technology that makes not only the systems operate more efficiently, but we now have technology that completely informs the traveler. We never had that in my early career days at all. And we never really talked about the only public meetings that were held were because of a federal requirement to ask these questions, but there was no focus on the traveler, and there was certainly no tech to help the traveler navigate what their choices were. So, one of the first things that I always think about in tech that I personally think was significant was providing real time information to the public, not just to the agency internally. That was step number one, was okay, I now have this tech where I know where all my vehicles are as an operator of a service. But that shifted towards, well, why can't we give the public that same information? And I think in the last probably 5 or 6 years, that's gotten extended to not only telling people about when the next bus is going to arrive, but also giving them information to potentially make a better environmental choice.
Gosh, okay. So there's a whole bunch of emerging technologies. Two of the big ones being autonomy and I would say. How can agencies avoid chasing this shiny object or shiny object syndrome when it comes to these technologies and instead focusing on maybe the outcome, so the real world, thoughtful and impactful implementation that benefits the end users rather than just, oh, I'm implementing this because it sounds cool.
Yeah, you're really speaking to me with that question, because throughout the years, as I've consulted to many different public transport authorities, if I would be at a in the early days, if I would be at a conference with them with a trade show floor, I'd be walking with them and they'd say, "Oh, look at that. Look at that tool. I really need that tool." And I'd say, "Okay, you're not going to like what I'm going to say next, but why do you need that particular tool?" Yeah, it looks cool. It's got a cool map on it or whatever else. Do you need it? So my philosophy in working with a lot of different agencies has always been sort of twofold. One, you have to start the process of thinking about technology by doing a needs assessment, which really requires agencies to sit down and identify where their pain points are, where their problems are. If you don't start there, you're going to jump right into the shiny thing on the trade show floor, and then potentially going to spend a lot of money on something you truly don't need. The need might be elsewhere. Also, in today's world, there are some tools available for agencies to assess their readiness, because it's not only the need for specific technologies to address the issues, but it's having an educated workforce to be able to work to bring those technologies to deployment. And if you don't have the right people, or you're not educating your people about the technology, but also about an implementation process, it's probably not going to be very successful. It's very well known that the majority of IT projects, not ITS, but IT projects, are often fraught with multiple problems. They are not deployed, the technology is not deployed successfully, and it's because they didn't do a needs assessment typically, and they didn't look inward and say, do we have the right people with the right skills? If we don't, should we go outside to get somebody? Sometimes that's the right thing. Sometimes just by educating the internal workforce, you've got the right people in the right places to make that technology work. So you're not going after the shiny object. You're saying, okay, from what I studied, and and by the way, it's also very hard for agencies to look inward with a magnifying glass.
Mm.
It's a lot easier for someone like me to come in from the outside with no preconceived notions and say that. But I also believe a lot of agencies can do this on their own. They don't necessarily need outside folks.
It does sound like to avoid being overwhelmed, to I think people look at the technology and then try to find a place to put it instead of looking at the problem and then trying to find the fit for where or which technology might fit into that problem space.
And I think we're experiencing that a little bit out, outside of public transit with AI, in a conversation I believe that you and I and a few other people had last year at the 2024 ITS World Congress, where it seemed like every presentation had AI in it, when in fact there really was no AI. They just threw the term in because that was the particular buzzword. I think we're getting past that a bit, where AI is becoming really useful in certain cases. You said something before which I really, really liked. Things need to be outcome based. You're not just deploying technology to deploy it. That is not what we're doing. People are not spending that kind of money. So where AI and machine language is very useful is one thing, but what's the outcome? What's the problem you're trying to solve?
One thing you mentioned earlier in the conversation, it was around equity and diversity. So I th- it's important to have diversity of voices when making transport and mobility decisions. And diversity, I think, can mean a whole bunch of different things. It can make sure you have users, non-users, agencies. It doesn't just have to be a particular kind of set of characteristics. How can agencies practically embed equity into their decision making or their technology planning?
I think there are a couple of ways that they can do it. And I've been fortunate to have some really in depth discussions with people in areas that have a very diverse population, whether it's from a cultural perspective or just an overall diversity of people and their needs for transport. So a couple of different things. And I get concerned about this because I feel like some of these approaches are actually the first things to be cut if the budget isn't big enough. But here are the couple of approaches that I think are most helpful to make sure that the system is equitable and that the technologies being put in place are also accessible to everyone. And that is to make sure that you're going through almost a co-creation process. You're bringing those diverse people to the table and you're going out of your way to bring them to the table. And I'll relate this to a conversation that I had with someone from New Zealand about bringing sort of the analogy to our American Indians when you're bringing the original cultures in to talk about things like transport and transport technology. These are people who often cannot go to a meeting. They have no way of getting to a meeting. Well, let's back up. They're often not asked because they're not right in front of the planners. We need to really understand our populations. So they need to be asked to the table, but you need to support that. But most importantly, you need to provide them with a voice to speak about this in whatever way they view it. And having a variety of meetings and a variety of media that people can also utilize to join a meeting to voice their interests, concerns is truly important. And that comes at the very, very beginning. You don't want to wait until you've said, well, the solution is this contactless card for everybody to pay a fare. Well, it's kind of late in the game. If you're bringing someone in after you've decided that and you find out that you've got a population that is either um, unbanked or underbanked and really can only pay with cash every time they ride. So you need to start things at a very, very early in the planning process, but also you can't ask them once. You have to keep them involved. This is what we heard you say. Could you validate that for us? And you need to bring them back when you're implementing the system. I think those things make sure that you haven't left anybody behind and you're not designing technology for people who won't be able to utilize it. If you can invent a technology or a system that can be used by an 8-year-old, it can probably be used by an 80-year-old or vice versa. That's looking at frankly some people that are my age. They're not fond of using technology. And if you tell them, well, the only way you can access that information is by getting on a computer and going to the internet, some people my own age that would stop them in their tracks.
There's a lot of complex. I think this conversation's revealed that there are a lot of complex challenges when we're looking at transport and all the problems that can arise and the solutions that could potentially be applied. So given that there isn't any, one silver bullet to things like traffic congestion or environmental issues or electrification, what ITS solutions do you think have the most promise to address any of those issues or some of these issues?
I think the solutions that really, to me, have the most promise is that they have to be developed. I'll tell you what they are in a minute, but they have to be developed in a very multimodal environment. So, for example, we always talk about traffic congestion, and there are many technologies available to try to address that. We need to look at what at one point here we called integrated corridor management. So it's not one tool, but it's an umbrella of tools that you can use to look at the entire situation. In other words, it's not just about traffic congestion, it's about what are the solutions that go beyond the congestion itself. So, in other words, things like incentives or nudges. So rather than that person getting on the road in their single occupant vehicle, I can provide them with a tool that may incentivize them to take that trip another way. And that's, and I'm not suggesting that that's an easy thing, but it is, and you mentioned the complexities. It's complex even to provide incentives to people if you would like them to make a different choice. It has to be much more thoughtful. People don't often think about things like incentives as technology, but it really is. It has to be embedded in the technology if you really want people to change their behavior. So it needs to be broad based, multimodal, and things like incentives related to payment technology, for example, is one thing that I think is very useful. The other is we've tried to come up with these broad-based solutions like mobility as a service. And the mistake everybody made with that, and this isn't pointing fingers at any one entity, because we've all been on this train for more than 10 years now, is not the philosophy is not if you build it, they will come, which is what a lot of transport tech started out like. Just because mobility is a service, somebody built an app, they forgot, like, just by virtue of having an app showing you all of your transport options does not mean that you're going to change your mind. You need to do more than that. And there need to be things going on in the background amongst the providers. That's another thing that we don't talk about. I think if a lot of that existed with mobility as a service, maybe it would have been a little more successful if there are partnerships.
So one thing I was going to ask you based on the story with watching trains in New York. So in Sydney, we recently just got a new driverless metro, which I love. I use it all the time
Yes.
to get to work. It reminds me so much of all the stuff that I've experienced traveling through Asia, and I'm so glad we finally have one here.
Yes.
Is there a city whose transportation system you admire? It can be anywhere in the world.
That is such a difficult question because obviously, everywhere I've traveled, I'm going to be on public transport. It's kind of hard to not mention Tokyo, one of the most complex public transport systems in the world. it is interconnected in a way that almost doesn't exist anywhere else, because many of the services provided in Tokyo are provided by different entities. This isn't one big government system. It's 7 or 8 different companies operating services. But when you look at the map, they're all interconnected. And that is something that I so admire, because so much of that is, frankly, an administrative nightmare. But the thought that you could actually connect different public transport services with each other, and you can go from point A to point B and not even know that you've actually been on services provided by 3 different entities, for example. And I think, because thinking about how complex that is from an administrative and a management perspective, I've always been tremendously impressed. They even made their payment cards interconnected. This is not something we've been able to do here very well at all.
No. Have you been to Seoul in South Korea?
Yes, I
I
have.
I love their metro system.
Yes.
Because I was in Taiwan, gosh, maybe a year ago, almost a year ago now. And one thing that my team found was the train systems were so confusing, because you had 2 different systems, and if you wanted to go to certain places, you had to use the other, but if you wanted to go somewhere else, use the other one, and it just wasn't, like, really clear, and some of the trains were, like, ticketed only, and others you had to prepay. But then in Korea, you've got everything signed, the app tells you which doors to be in if you wanna transfer to certain lines. I was like, "This is amazing."
Yes. Yes. And in Tokyo, um, with some very, very complex stations
Mm,
where all of the entrances and exits are numbered, and then you have a guide. If you want to go to City Hall, that's exit 5.
mm.
And the wayfinding is so good.
Reflecting on your career so far, is there a moment or a project that you feel proud of, or one that kind of made you think, like, this is kind of why I do what I do and why I'm interested in it?
There's two. I think the first one is more significant. I have done a lot of uh, de- developing coursework around teaching people about public transport technology, how you design it, how you procure it, how you implement it, um, how you use standards. And when I did that course development, it wasn't clear to me what the outcome would be when I stood in front of people who wanted to learn about this. What was I being successful in communicating what these technologies were, how they worked, how do you use technology within an overall planning, transport planning process, all of that. The thing that I was most proud of was one of the courses that I developed and ended up teaching them at New York City Transit. Needless to say, for me, it was a complete full circle. I was a little girl looking at subway trains going in and out and asking all kinds of questions, just being enamored with the whole thing. And here I am as a transport professional now teaching people at this very same agency about this technology. And I felt really, really good about not just my own completing a circle, but being able to communicate with people who really wanted to learn about this. This was an area that they were going to work in going forward. So that was one project. When I work directly with agencies, it's helping them again design something that they need, helping them go to the market and procure it, helping to oversee how it's implemented and ensuring that it's implemented properly with the overall goal of helping the public. And I know it sounds kind of corny to say that, but I have been very, very fortunate to work with some agencies where I do get to see the direct outcome. The only other thing that comes to mind is I was one of the first people here in the States, not in the world by any stretch, to study real time transit information. And I did one of the first research projects in the US actually looking at one, how do we even do this? But two, what are the things that agencies need to be thinking about as they try to design this type of solution? Strangely enough, I still see people citing stuff that I wrote way more than 20 years ago, which I would think would just be nobody would be reading it because it's old now. But that was very exciting.
Carol, thank you so much for your time today and for coming onto the podcast to chat with me.
I loved every minute of it. Thank you so much for asking me. Um, I I am passionate about this whole area, so I really appreciated you asking me to come on the podcast. Thank you.
To learn more about any of the guests that we have on the Bite Size podcast, you can check out our show notes at compassiot.substack.com. Alternatively, if you'd like to know more about the company that runs this podcast, Compass IoT, you can visit our website, which is compassiot.com.au. Until next time.